Hello and welcome back to Chapter 2 of The Miner's Daughters, A Tale of the Peak, where in our first chapter we met our family and their lives up in, it sounds like somewhere in England. I don't know exactly where because I've never been to England, but somewhere out in the countryside, up in the mountainous areas, although according to the author, it's not really mountains, it's actually hills, but big enough for mountains for these people. I would probably also call it mountains, but that's because I live in a fairly flat area, although surprisingly, where I live in Michigan, we do have some pretty good mountains and cliffs just farther to the north and west of where I live. I'm in kind of a flat area. And yeah, we met the family. We met the husband who is a miner and his wife who keeps the home and their three children who do what kids do and one day go out and have an adventure up on the mountain that ended in disaster. So we're going to jump back in and see what happens after the death of the oldest child, the young boy, uh, poor little David, and see what else is going to happen. I'm kind of curious. Also, a huge thank you to Georgia for giving me a translation on what the father was saying in that one passage that seemed like foreign gobbledygook to me, even though the words I was reading were English. They were all slang I had never heard. Hopefully, we won't have to have another translation, but I make no guarantees on that. Anyway, we're going to be jumping back into chapter 2, which is titled Mill Life. We must pass over the painful and dreadful particulars of that night and of a long time to come. The maniacal rage of the father, the shattered heart and feelings of the mother, the dreadful state of the two remaining children, to whom their brother was one of the most precious objects in a world which, like theirs, contained so few. One moment, to have seen him full of life and fun and bravado, and almost the next a lifeless and battered corpse, was something too strange and terrible to soon be surmounted. But this was woefully aggravated by the cruel anger of their father, who continued to regard them as guilty of the death of his favorite boy. He seemed to take no pleasure in them. He never spoke to them but to scold them. He drank more deeply than ever and came home later, and when there was sullen and morose. When their mother, who suffered severely but still plodded on with all her duties, said, "David, they are thy children too," he would reply savagely, "Haud thy tongue! What's a pack of wenches to my lad?" What tended to render the miner more hard towards the two girls was a circumstance which would have awakened a better feeling in a softer father's heart. Nancy, the younger girl, since the dreadful catastrophe, had seemed to grow gradually dull and defective in her intellect. She had a slow and somewhat idiotic air and manner. Her mother perceived it and was struck with consternation by it. She tried to rouse her, but in vain. She could not perform her ordinary reading and spelling lessons. She seemed to have forgotten what was already learned. She appeared to have a difficulty in moving her legs and carried her hands as if she had suffered a partial paralysis. Jane, her sister, was dreadfully distressed at it, and she and her mother wept many bitter tears over her. One day in the following spring, they took her with them to Ashford and consulted the doctor there. On examining her, and hearing fully what had taken place at the time of her brother's death, the fate of which he well knew, for of course it was known to the whole country round, he shook his head and said he was afraid they must make up their minds to a sad case, that the terrors of that night had affected her brain, and that, through it, the whole nervous system had suffered, and was continuing to suffer the most melancholy effects. The only thing, he thought, in her favor was her youth, and he added that it might have a good effect if they could leave the place where she had undergone such a terrible shock, but whether they did or not, kindness and soothing attentions to her would do more good than anything else. Mrs. Dunster and little Jane returned home with heavy hearts. The doctor's opinion had only confirmed their fears, for Jane, though a child, had a quickness and affection for her sister enough to make her comprehend the awful nature of poor Nancy's condition. Mrs. Dunster told her husband the doctor's words, for she thought they would awaken some tenderness in him towards the unfortunate child, but he said, "That's just what I expect. How'll grow soft, and then who's to maintain her? How mun go to the workhouse." With that, he took his mandorel and went off to work. Instead of softening his nature, this intelligence only seemed to harden and brutalize it. He drank now more and more. But all that summer, the mother and Jane did all they could think of to restore the health and mind of poor Nancy. Every morning, when the father was gone to work, Jane went to a spring in the opposite wood, famed for the coldness and sweetness of its water. On this account, the proprietors of the mills at Chesbrook had put down a large trough there under the spreading trees, and the people fetched water even from the village. Hence Jane brought at many journeys this cold, delicious water to bathe her sister in. They then rubbed her with warm cloths and gave her new milk for her breakfast. Her lessons were not left off, lest the mind should sink into faulty, but were made as easy as possible. Jane continued to talk to her and laugh with her as if nothing were amiss, though she did it with a heavy heart, and she engaged her to weed and hoe with her in their little garden. She did not dare lead her far out into the valley, lest it might excite her memory of the past fearful time, but she gathered her flowers and continued to play with her at all the accustomed spots, about building houses with pieces of pots and stones, and imagining gardens and parks. The anxious mother, when some weeks were gone by, fancied that there really was some improvement. The cold bathing seemed to have strengthened the system. The poor child walked and bore herself with more freedom and firmness. She became ardently fond of being with her sister and attentive to her directions, but there was a dull cloud over her intellect and a vacancy in her eyes and features. She was quiet, easily pleased, but seemed to have little volition of her own. Mrs. Dunster thought if they could but get her away from that spot, it might rouse her mind from its sleep. But perhaps the sleep was better than the awakening might be. However, the removal came, though in a more awful way than was looked for. The miner, who had continued to drink more and more, and seemed to have almost estranged himself from his home, staying away in his drinking bouts for a week or more together, was one day blasting a rock in the mine, and being half stupefied with beer, did not take care to get out of the way of the explosion. He was struck with a piece of the flying stone and killed on the spot. The poor widow and her children were now obliged to remove from under Wardlow Cop. The place had been a sad one to her. The death of her husband, though he had been latterly far from a good one, it had left her and her children in deep poverty, and it was a fresh source of severe grief to her. Her religious mind was struck down with a weight of melancholy by the reflection of the life he had led and the sudden way in which he had been summoned to eternity. When she looked forward, what a prospect there was for her children! It was impossible for her to maintain them from her small earnings. And as to Nancy, would she ever be able to earn her own bread and protect herself in the world? It was amid such reflection that Mrs. Dunster quitted this deep, solitary, and to her fatal valley, and took up her abode in the village of Cressbrook. Here she had one small room, and by her own labors and some aid from the parish, she managed to support herself and the children. For 7 years she continued her laborious life, assisted by the labor of the 2 daughters, who also seamed stockings, and in the evenings they were instructed by her. Her girls were now 13 and 15 years of age. Jane was a tall and very pretty girl of her years. She was active, industrious, and sweet-tempered. Her constant affection for poor Nancy was something as admirable as it was singular. Nancy had now confirmed good health, but it had affected her mother to perceive that since the catastrophe of her brother's death and the cruel treatment of her father at that time, she had never grown in any degree as she ought. She was short, stout, and of a pale and very plain countenance. It could not be now said that she was deficient in mind, but she was slow in its operation. She displayed, indeed, a more than ordinary depth of reflection and a shrewdness of observation, but the evidence of this came forth in a very quiet way, and were observable only to her mother and sister. To all besides, she was extremely reserved. She was timid to excess, and shrunk from public notice in the society of her mother and sister. There was a feeling abroad in the neighborhood that she was not quite right, but the few who were more discerning shook their heads and observed, right she was not, poor thing, but it's not want of sense. She's had more of that than most. And such was the opinion of her mother and sister. They perceived that Nancy had received a shock of which she must bear the effects throughout her life. Circumstances might bring her feeble but sensitive nerves much misery. She required to be guarded and sheltered from the rudeness of the world, and the mother trembled to think how much she might be exposed to them. But in everything that related to sound judgment, they knew that she surpassed not only them, but any one of their acquaintance. If any difficulty had to be decided, it was Nancy who pondered on it, and perhaps at some moment when least expected, pronounced an opinion that might be taken confidently as an oracle. The affection of the 2 sisters was something beyond the ties of this world. Jane had watched and attended her from the time of her constitutional injury with a love that never seemed to know a moment's weariness or change, and all the affection which Nancy evinced for her was equally intense. She seemed to hang on her society for her very life, and Jane felt this and vowed that they would never quit one another. The mother sighed. How many things, she thought, might tear asunder this beautiful resolve. But now they were of an age to obtain work in the mill. Indeed, Jane could have had employment there long before, but she would not quit her sister until she could go with her, and now there they went. The proprietor, who knew the case familiarly, so ordered it that the two sisters should work near to each other, and that poor Nancy should be as little exposed to the rudeness of the work people as possible. But at first, so slow and awkward were Nancy's endeavors, and such an effect had it on her frame, that it was feared that she might give it up. This would have been a terrible calamity, and the tears of the two sisters and the benevolence of their employer enabled Nancy to pass through the severe ordeal. In a while, she acquired sufficient dexterity, and thenceforward went through her work with great accuracy and perseverance. As for any intercourse with the work people was concerned, she might be said to be dumb. Scarcely ever did she exchange a word with anyone, but she returned kind nods and smiles, and every morning and evening and at dinner time the two sisters might be seen going to and fro side by side, Jane often talking with some of the people, and her little odd-looking sister walking along silently listening. 5 more years, and now Jane was a young woman. Amid her companions, who were few, above middle size, she had a tall and very striking appearance. Her father had been a remarkably tall and strong man, and Jane possessed something of his stature, though none of his irritable disposition. She was extremely pretty, of a blooming, fresh complexion and a graceful form. She was remarkable for the sweetness of her expression, which was the index of her disposition. By her side went that odd, broad-built, but still pale and small sister. Jane was extremely admired by the young men of the neighborhood, and already had many offers, but listened to none. "Where I go, must Nancy go," she said to herself. "And of whom can I be sure?" Of Nancy no one took notice. Her pale, somewhat large feature, her thoughtful, silent look, and her short, stout figure gave you the idea of a dwarf, though she could not strictly be called one. No one would think of Nancy as a wife. Where Jane went, she must go. The two clung together with one heart and soul. The blow which deprived them of their brother seemed to have bound them inseparably together. Mrs. Dunster, besides her seaming, at which in truth she earned a miserable amount, had now for some years been the postwoman from the village to the Bull's Head, where the mail going to Tideswell left the letter bags. Thither and back, wet or dry, summer or winter, she went every day, year round. With her earnings, and those of the girls, she kept herself a neat small cottage, and the world went well with them, as the world goes on the average with the poor. Cramps and rheumatisms she began to feel sensibly from so much exposure to the rain and cold, but the never-varying and firm affection of her two children was a balm in her cup which made her content with everything else. When Jane was about 22, poor Mrs. Dunster, seized with rheumatic fever, died. On her deathbed, she said to Jane, "Thou wilt never desert poor Nancy, and that's my comfort. God has been good to me. After all my trouble, he's given me this faith that come weal, come woe, as long as thou hast a home, Nancy will never want for one. God bless thee for it. God bless you both, and he will bless you." And so saying, Betty Dunster breathed her last. The events immediately following her death did not seem to bear out her dying faith, for the poor girls were obliged to give up their cottage. There was a want of cottages. Not half the work people could be entertained in this village. They went to and fro for many miles. Jane and Nancy were now obliged to do the same. Their cottage was wanted for an overlooker, and they removed to Tideswell 3 miles off. They had thus 6 miles daily to walk, besides standing at their work, but they were young and had companions. In Tideswell they were more cheerful. They had a snug little cottage. They were near a meeting, and they found friends. They did not complain. Here again, Jane Dunster attracted great attention, and a young, thriving grocer paid his address to her. It was an offer that made Jane take time to reflect. Everyone said it was an opportunity not to be neglected, but Jane weighed it in her mind. Will he keep faith in my compact with Nancy? Though her admirer made every vow on the subject, Jane paused and determined to take the opinion of Nancy. Nancy thought for a day and then said, "Dear sister, I don't feel easy. I fear that from some cause it would not do in the end." And Jane, from that moment on, gave up the idea of the connection. There might be those who would suspect Nancy of a selfish bias in the advice she gave. But Jane knew that no such feeling influenced her pure soul. For 1 long year, the two sisters traversed the hills between Cressbrook Brook and Tideswell, but they had companions, and it was pleasant in the summer. But winter came, and then it was a severe trial. To rise in the dark and traverse those wild, bleak hills, to go through snow and drizzle, and face the sharpest winds in the winter was no trifling matter. Before winter was over, the two young women began seriously to revolve the chances of a closer residence or a change of employ. There were no few who blamed Jane excessively for the folly of refusing the last good offer for her hand. There were even more than one who, in the hearing of Nancy, blamed her. Nancy was thoughtful and agitated and wept. "If I can, dear sister," she said, "have advised you to your injury, how will I forgive myself? What shall become of me?" But Jane clasped her sister to her heart and said, "No, no, dearest sister, you are not to blame. I feel you are right. Let us wait, and we shall see." Oh, and that is the end of the chapter. That was shorter than I thought, and now I want to know what happens next. But I guess that will be our final night with this story, which will be the next time we sit down together for it. I actually really like this story. It hasn't completely sucked me in, but I think I feel like this one might be my favorite of all of them in the book so far. So, interesting. I don't know that I would want to live in their times, that's for sure. It sounds terrible. And it really sounds like young Nancy could use a better doctor and, well, honestly, a better father. But, yeah, I'm kind of liking this story. So one more night, I might have already said that our next book, when we finish this one, is going to be Pride and Prejudice. I am definitely looking forward to that. But one more night to find out, is Jane going to find a suitor who will take her and her sister in? Is Nancy really jealous and doesn't actually want her sister to ever get married and possibly leave her? Tune in next time when we'll find out. Anyway, thanks for coming with me on this journey to the peak, and I will see you next time.